He is a non-resident fellow here at Stinson with our program, and he is a surface warfare officer in the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. He recently received his master's in international relations from Tufts University. He is speaking today in his personal capacity as a researcher and not as an officer of JMSDF. Next to Yoshi is Lieutenant Colonel Kanasato, also a non-resident fellow with our program, and a master's candidate at the Elliott School at GW. He served over 10 years as an F-15 pilot in the Japan Air Self-Defense Force, and he has contributed to the Joint Task Force on Ballistic Missile Defense during the 2016 North Korean missile scare. And across from me, last but not least, is Masashi Murano. He is a fellow at Hudson Institute. He has also spent 9 years conducting research, analysis, and facilitation of numerous classified products related to strategic intelligence assessment and policy planning for the government of Japan. And finally, not present with us today, but speaking through video, is Takahisa Kawaguchi. He is a senior fellow at Tokyo Marine and Nichino Risk Consulting Company in Tokyo. He is a research member of the 21st Century Public Policy Institute at Keidanren and a co-researcher at the Center for Global Security at the National Defense Academy of Japan. So, Ayumi, would you like to get us started?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Pam, and thank you for all of you for coming today. And let me also thank Yuki and the rest of her team for making this panel possible during this precarious time. I'm really happy to be here. I'd like to begin my remarks by sort of explaining why I titled my chapter as Japan as a stable builder of force in the Indo-Pacific. And the key phrase here is the word stable. And one of the striking features of Japan over the last several years and almost a decade has been its relative stability. And by stability, I'm not just talking about Abe's longest tenure or weaker positions that allow LDP to be in power for such a long time, but I'm more talking about this broad consensus that exists among elites and public about general direction of its foreign policy and its security policy, and how Japan can cope with this shifting balance of power in the Pacific. Often I hear the phrase among scholars and others that states in Asia do not want to choose between Beijing and Washington. Personally, I do think the more correct way to say it is states in Asia do not want to be forced to choose between Washington or Beijing. I think it's fair to say in the case of Japan, it has almost voluntarily chose United States after witnessing Chinese sheer military, political, economic presence that could pose a challenge to the regional and global order from which Japan has benefited and wants to maintain going forward. According to the most recent cabinet poll, cabinet office polling last October, that's about 3 years into Trump presidency, still 95.1% answered the relationship with the US is important for the future of Japan. And 95% is a staggering number in any polling in a democracy, especially when European allies are questioning the role of the United States and its future commitment. The concept of free and open in the Pacific is originally an invention of Abe from his speech in 2016, but the fundamental features of this concept are rooted in the previous concepts from 2006 when he gave a speech in India about confluence of the seas. And also Prime Minister Aso, who was a successor of Abe, also promoted this concept of freedom, arc of freedom and prosperity. So the general consensus in Japan, as I read it, is as follows. On one hand, Japan is faced with the reality of declining material capabilities, while on the other hand, Japan's national identity and its preferences that it does not want to live under the influence of Chinese coercion has been crystallized and intensified. So now Japan has limited choice. To manage security challenges emanating from Beijing and to maintain this level of international order rooted in market economy and rule of law, Japan would need to do more with less on its own, as well as with other like-minded states, including the United States. So how does Japan do this? how can Japan achieve doing more with less? As I argue in this report, Japan should harness its two biggest comparative advantages, vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis other liberal democracies, including the United States. First, Japan has its network of friendly countries in Asia and Europe that China does not possess. This portfolio overlaps mostly with US-friendly list of US allies and friends, but not always identical. This is an asset that Japan has gained through 75 years of diplomatic reconciliation efforts after World War II. Second, the domestic unity on foreign policy direction that I just laid out is a precious asset in democracy that other liberal democracies don't always enjoy, most prominently by the United States. This shared understanding about future direction of its foreign policy is what could allow Japan to be the center of gravity in amassing forces and actors into the Indo-Pacific, not just from Asia, but also from Europe and North America to collectively compete with China. Japan should leverage these two factors and aims to institutionalize collaborations and bind these partners into the preferred initiatives. As political scientists often say, institutions are sticky. They can have enduring effect, which could be utilized for your own benefit. So in what areas should Japan take the lead in bringing various actors to collaborate? I raise 4 broad areas in my report. First is to expand on military cooperation with other like-minded states and through joint exercises and intelligence sharing. This is basically my proposal to argue that Japan should keep doing what it has been doing last several years, and this trend should be continued and enhanced. Among the countries that Japan conducts bilateral joint exercises, the ones that self-defense forces exercise in all 3 services is US, India, and Britain. Only in air and at sea is Australia, and those only at sea are France, Canada, and Philippines. We can envision Japan upgrading these exercises with Australia, France, Canada, Philippines to all 3 service level of cooperation and exercises. The second area for further cooperation is on capacity building efforts for ASEAN and the smaller maritime states. France, Canada, Britain have already shown interest in the Indo-Pacific, with Britain conducting freedom of navigation operations. And India, Japan, and Australia are all engaging in port visits, arms sales, and Coast Guard training with ASEAN states. As part of BNTN vision announced in 2016, Japan has been engaging in a series of activities to enhance defense cooperation with ASEAN states. And other like-minded states are doing a similar thing with ASEAN states, but I think moving forward, it will be beneficial for us to actually collaborate on those initiatives so that we are actually being intentional about achieving shared objectives and do not accidentally leave a vacuum in Southeast Asia. The third area of cooperation is to find more co-sponsors in Asian and African investment frameworks. This is important for Japan and other like-minded states that all face budgetary constraints. As Japan did with India in co-sponsoring Asia-Africa and Growth Corridor, which focuses on investment along the maritime states in Africa and Asia, it should also seek other co-sponsors in Canberra, London, Paris, and Ottawa. These collaborations, if done well, can play an important role in offsetting the gigantic resources that Chinese leadership can tap into without much public dissent. These types of cooperation would not only bring about this more financial resources through joint funding efforts, but also help this initiative to continue even when 1 or 2 democracies are falling into domestic turmoil. TPP illustrates this example very well. As many of you know, in the case of Trans-Pacific Partnership, US, who led the initiative, left the initiative after President Trump took office. But Japan saved the TPP with the remaining 11 countries. This allowed for creation of institutions to which Washington can come back to after resolving the debates domestically on the role of free trade. In this way, if the collaborative frameworks are institutionalized, and as long as some partners can fill in the vacuum to continue on the initiative, while others are settling some domestic debates, we can actually engage in a longer-term pursuit of shared objectives. Finally, Japan and other like-minded states would need to start thinking about how to deal with divergence among allies and partners on the China question. In particular, where to place the issue of Taiwan in this broader Indo-Pacific order. Many more liberal democracies are sharing the threat perception of China, either as a challenger to territorial integrity, sovereignty, or global commons. But they have not yet come to terms with the question of where this issue of Taiwan falls into. The issue of Taiwan has been historically an issue of a bargain between US and China, but we all know that issue of Taiwan represents much larger things. It is an issue of defense of first island chain that Japan is a part of, China's anti-access area denial challenges, credibility of a US military commitment over areas that A2AD falls under, and the viability of free and open in the Pacific order. Of course, Japan's ties with Taiwan has its own historical connotations that would almost inevitably bring backlash from Beijing. So it would be prudent if we approach this issue multilaterally, where US could perhaps liaise Taipei with other liberal democracies in start talking about informal and incremental strategic talks. That concludes my initial remarks, and I look forward to engaging more discussion with the audience. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Pam, this is live streaming, right? The camera is over there. Right? Hello, friends all over the world. Okay, I'm Yoshimi Sato, knowledge fellow at the Stimson Center, and originally from the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, as you can see. Today, I'd like to talk about the defense of Japan in a hyper-executive society. I will use the PowerPoint slide to cover my English. Okay. The security environment around Japan has become increasingly tense. Despite the President Donald Trump's top-down effort to engage Kim Jong-un on denuclearization, North Korea continues to develop nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. China is expanding and intensifying the activities in East and South China Sea, and its military strategy continues to lack transparency. In addition, Russia has changed the status quo in Ukraine with hybrid warfare, which intentionally makes the boundaries between combat and non-combat activities unclear. Similar tactics might be used in the Japanese Northern Territory Islands in the future. Yes, considering the current circumstances, Ministry of Defense and Self-Defense Force must secure highly qualified personnel who can respond to the diversified missions. However, the recruitment of uniformed self-defense force personnel has been a serious challenge. In 2019, the number of authorized strengths of self-defense force personnel and actual number, the gap is about 20,000. Most recently, the National Defense Program Guideline identified securing human resources as an imminent challenge in the face of shrinking and aging population with declining birth rate. Therefore, it is important to analyze the current population shift in Japan and explore how to reinforce human resource bases in the self-defense force. As for the transition of aging and estimation in the future, the annual report on the aging society and the annual report on the declining birth rate elaborates on the urgency that surrounds the Japanese shrinking and aging population. Japanese total population began to decline in 2011 and is estimated to decrease from 126 million to 88 million between 2018 and 2065. With overall trend of this decreasing, the working age population is estimated to shrink to 45 million by 2065. The elderly population will reach 38% of the total population in 2065. Simply put, 1 in 3 Japanese will be older than 65 years old in 2065. Given such circumstances, the Ministry of Defense and Self-Defense Force has already begun to take measures to mitigate the impact of shrinking and aging society in Japan. The screen shows the current measures to utilize the human resources effectively, such as expanding women's participation. For example, first female paratrooper this month, first female captain of an Aegis destroyer, and first female fighter pilot. As for the measure to better organization to shrinking population, the Ministry of Defense raised the upper age limit for entrance of new self-defense force personnel from 26 years old to 32 years old in order to expand the recruitment of enlisted soldiers. But there are further measures that may be worth considering. In the United States, for instance, each service has a different enlistment age limit. Given that their personal abilities, personal requirements, and physical abilities for each service differ, setting appropriate age limits for each self-defense force services will be a good way in order to expand the number of eligible Japanese for some of the services. As a measure for the aging societies, the Ministry of Defense announced in December 2018 that it would gradually extend the mandatory retirement ages for self-defense force personnel. In today's Japan, the current average lifespan is 81 years old for men and 87 for women. This is expected to increase every year, reaching 84 and 91 years, respectively, in 2065. The extension of life expectancy indicates that current old people may be healthier than before. As the average life continues to lengthen, the Ministry of Defense should consider further extension of mandatory retirement ages in order to leverage the potential of old people who have rich knowledge, skills, and experiences. The Ministry of Defense also needs to take further measures to increase the self-defense forces' attractiveness in order to encourage talented people to choose the military as their career. One of the necessary measures is enhancing welfare and benefits to build a system which incentivizes people to join the self-defense force. In case of the United States, the merits of entering the military are conveyed clearly, such as military discount at the shop or restaurants, free or discounted admissions to museums and amusement parks, and airline benefits for military families. the Ministry of Defense should look into the possibility of incorporating such measures to improve the self-defense forces' competitiveness. Another measure is encourage the younger generation to join the military through education. Television shows, movies, games, comic books can all be the useful educational tools. In the United States, the number of applicants to the military increased due to the movie 1986 Top Gun. It is said that the first female Japanese fighter was influenced the Top Gun. And I think Taro-san is as well, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't wait.
But one of the Marine fighters said 2020 Top Gun Maverick will not have the same effect on the recruitment because the real combat in 2020 is different from the one in 1986. The era is changing. No one imagines that the jacket badge on the Tom Cruise of Japanese and Taiwanese flags were swapped out this year. I know the reason, but I won't say anymore. Anyway, I did conducted the interview with former commanding general of Marine Corps Recruitment Command. He observed that recruitment is an emotional decision for young persons who have never made decisions for themselves. He advised to involve the young people in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations because they want to feel good about their sacrifices. It is important to consider the realistic and effective recruitment measures through the positive media portraits, internet, and social media. As a conclusion, the Ministry of Defense may be able to learn from the practices of other countries which are facing similar population problems. In Asia only, for instance, the total fertility rate in Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan are also below replacement level. Researching how these societies secure the human resources in their military will be useful in devising the Japanese measures. Finally, in order for the Ministry of Defense and the self-defense force to sustain Japan's defense capability, it may be necessary to review if the current authorized strength of self-defense personnel is sufficient to respond to increasing threats around Japan. In Japan, although there is still an allergy to discussion about military, security, and war, Japan should creatively debate realistic and practical ways to prevent and deter following wars. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you, Pam and Yuki-san, for allowing me to talk here today. My topic today is security space policy. And I will quickly introduce Japanese perspectives on security space environment. And later, I will discuss on policy recommendations. First of all, we recognize space as a new warfighting domain. And our primary concern in space is Chinese counter-space capabilities and Chinese space-based C4ISR capabilities. Chinese counter-space capabilities are able to deny, disrupt, and destroy our, Japanese and US critical warfighting capabilities, which include command and control communication capabilities, as well as early warning and point navigation and timing capabilities. Chinese space-based C4ISR capabilities are able to find, fix, and track SDF, self-defense force, and US forces in Western Pacific, which include US carrier strike group, Japanese maritime fleet, and the readiness of Air Force bases of air self-defense force. and the US Air Force in Western Pacific. Chinese satellite information is integrated to Chinese precision-guided weapons, which include ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and even ASBM, anti-ship ballistic missiles, which is DF-21D or DF-26. Those are the challenges we are facing in space and on Earth from space. Given those security environments, Japan should take a realistic approach to overcome those security challenges. But we also need to take a liberal institutional approach to avoid space weaponization to a maximum extent. To do so, I recommend 3 approaches Japan should take. 1, multilateral approach. 2, bilateral approach, which means US and Japan. And also, Japan also needs to take a whole of Japan approach to maintain peace in space, to ensure prosperity through space, and to maintain space as a global commons. Let me talk about multilateral approach. I raised 4 recommendations on it. 1, shaping international norms of military use of space. Japan should actively participate in the formulation of space norms with other like-minded countries. Particularly, Japan should encourage a discussion on what activities or what actions in outer space fall under the definition of threat or use of force. Even if a consensus cannot be reached as a comprehensive international norm, dialogue with like-minded countries would be basis of corrective actions in the event of contingency in space. Number 2, promoting TCBM, transparency, and confidence-building measures. TCBM in space is also critical to stabilizing the security environment. Since the formulation of legally binding space norm is challenging to reach an agreement, which is, for example, disarmament or arms control of specific space weapons. But it would be more practical to promote TCBM, even they are not legally binding norm. For instance, we may establish geofence in a geosynchronous orbit, so which means we can limit the proximity operation in geosynchronous orbit, or we can conduct a mutual notification of proximity operation in space. Additionally, it might be possible to cooperate with China on active debris removal, since Japan and China, both of our countries are interested in those kind of operations. Number 3, strengthening the cooperation with like-minded space-developed countries. Japan should advance cooperation with like-minded space-developed countries, which is like US, UK, France, kind of countries. So, for example, Japanese participation on CSPOC framework, CSPOC is a Combined Space Operations Center framework, is beneficial not only for Japan, but also member countries because of Japanese unique geographic locations, and also we can provide unique Japanese technological advantages. Number 4, strengthening a cooperation through outer space with space developing countries. China established APSCO, which is Asia Pacific Space Cooperation Organization, in 2008. And China is advancing space cooperation with Asian countries. Thailand, Malaysia, or Philippines have joined to APSCO or are interested in joining to APSCO. Japan should seek any opportunities to cooperate with those space developing countries. For instance, to counterbalance the increase of Chinese influence in space. For instance, Japan has a QZSS, quasi-zenith satellite system, which can provide centimeter-class highly accurate position information. So utilizing those kind of a QZSS system to those countries for instance, like advanced agriculture, like social services, or even disaster risk management system, those efforts are beneficial for space developing countries, but also beneficial for Japan and the US, because we can then counterbalance the increase of Chinese influence in space. Secondly, I raised the 3 recommendations on bilateral approach, but let me talk about 2 things today. One, strengthening US-Japan cooperation in fundamental military functions. Given the impact of Chinese counter-space capabilities, especially for satellite communications, early warning, or position navigation timing capabilities, we should advance, US and Japan should advance cooperation in those areas. For example, US government announced National Defense Space Architecture, and which consists of like a multi-layered constellation satellite system. So Japan should advance the cooperation with the US to develop and deploy those kind of space architectures. Number 2, establishing a joint operating capability in space from peacetime to gray zone. US and Japan should deepen joint effort on how to respond to malicious actions by competitors in gray zone. Particularly, US and Japan need to establish joint ROEs on how to respond to attack by which the consequence is reversible. For instance, by laser dazzling, electric jamming, cyber attack, or any other malicious actions. Establishing a joint ROE is critical, not only for gray zone in terms of escalation control, but also which is beneficial to promote credibility of deterrence during the peacetime. Before the conclusion, let me talk about probably the most critical agenda we have to commit: cultivating space professionals. Cultivating space professionals who will play a central role for military space is the most significant agenda we have to conduct. Ministry of Defense and Self-Defense Force must accelerate the development of quality and quantity of human resources through the hiring and training, education, and even setting up the appropriate career paths. So those approaches by multilateral, bilateral, whole of Japan approach, those are critical to advance Japanese space policy in the future. To conclude, space environment brings huge challenge to Japan. Our primary concern is Chinese counter-space capability and Chinese space-based C4ISR capabilities with the modernization of missile capability of China. So Japan and the US should advance a cooperation with other like-minded countries to maintain peace in space, to ensure prosperity through space, and to maintain space as a global commons. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
So So in general, some part of or some kind of strategic documents have included both declaratory policies and guidance for implementing the policies in practice. However, it is difficult to reconcile those two elements, and the strategic document as a declaratory policy tended to insist on making efforts in all areas and all domains. However, making efforts in all domains is not a strategy. The strategy is about the prioritizing of the limited resources. Of course, that we understood that the difficulties in the prioritization. Actually, prioritization is not an easy job because the security environment facing Japan is a combination of low-intensity challenges, such as the gray zone with Chinese Coast Guard vessels in the East China Sea, and some high-intensity challenges, such as the anti-access area denial, which is the PLA ballistic missiles and cruise missiles are present. And the Chinese opportunistic creeping expansion without use of force. Actually, more precisely, it is not the use of force. More precisely, without firing the gun, such as the construction of the artificial islands in the South China Sea, and the normalization of activities by the naval vessels and the aircrafts around disputed territories may be prevented by the regular presence patrols and the regional training by the Japan's Coast Guard and the Japan Self-Defense Forces. This is one of the core concepts in the 2010 version of National Defense Program Guideline, which is a capstone document for our strategic defense strategies, so-called NDPG. The 2010 version NDPG is so-called Dynamic Defense Force, and the 2013 version NDPG is the so-called Dynamic Joint Defense Force. In my understanding, the 2018 version NDPG is also basically following the concepts. However, in a high-intensity environment, the forward presence becomes very vulnerable. So this is a competing demand. The problem is how to balance between the forward presence or presence patrol during the peacetime or gray zone, and avoiding the vulnerabilities of those kind of high-value assets. So ideally, Japan should have the right asset for the appropriate assets for each scenario or each security environment. But Japan's defense resources are limited, and it's needed to prioritize defense investments. So for this reason, some decisions raise some questions about the prioritizations. One of the typical example is the refurbishment of the Izumo-class helicopter carrier type destroyer. The refurbishment of these Izumo-class destroyers makes it possible to operate F-35B, given the SDF capability like a light aircraft carrier. I think that these combination with the Izumo-class DDH and the F-35B will be very effective in showing Japanese presence in the Southeast Asia and even in the Indian Ocean for the concept of the free and open in the Pacific. So it is not difficult to imagine that in the foreseeable future, Japan or US or the British F-35B will conduct joint exercise with Japanese aircraft carriers in the Western Pacific or Indian Ocean. However, they can only operate during the peacetime and gray zone. So in the early stage of the conflict, those kind of Japanese aircraft carriers became the high-value targets for China. So since aircraft carriers do not have the ability to defend against aerial assets themselves, so it is essential to operate under the protection of the company Aegis destroyers, some other air defense assets. However, it will be difficult in the practice to continue their operation in the high-stress anti-access area denial environment while exposed to Chinese anti-ship, ballistic, and cruise missiles and fighter bombers. So in that reason, that Izumo-class destroyers that has and the F-35B can operate effectively will be limited to presence operation from peacetime to gray zone. However, it is the same idea as Chinese aircraft carrier operation concept. So this is not consistent with the concept of the competitive strategy or cost imposition against China. So we can operate to the same domain when we had some plenty of the resources. Otherwise, we needed to compete effectively on the different domains, the favorable domains. We can take advantages. So therefore, we need to consider some more effective way to compete with China. And second, of course, that is also my personal opinion, but I think that Japan and the Japanese government can no longer maintain its exclusive defense-oriented policy, the so-called Senshiboe in Japanese. For example, one of the typical cases is the rise of the hypersonic weapons. They further reduce the reaction time of the defenders and expanding the challengers' advantages. So this is a common problems with other emerging technologies such as AI for speeding up the decision-making process, as well as the roles of the ground-based intermediate-range missiles in the post-INF world. And most emerging technologies and its applications in the battlefield of the amplified inherent the advantages of the challengers and making defenders increasingly at the disadvantages. So I am a supporter of the missile defense, but at the same time, we should discuss of the issue of how much is enough. And we should consider the backing up missile defense by possessing offensive strike capabilities by ourselves. So Japan should not engage in the war of aggressions, and in that sense, it should continue to be strategically defensive policy. However, we need to introducing the tactically offensive operations. So what Japan should have is not a strike capabilities as a deterrence by punishment, but a conventional counterforce capabilities for deterrence by denial. So we need it. In this regards, I supported Japan acquiring the ballistic missile options or hosting U.S. ground-based missiles. These will substitute mission kill capability for some Chinese air bases. And final point is the redefinition of the role and mission and capabilities of the U.S.-Japan alliance. Japan's strike capabilities, as I already pointed out, it must complement and strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance. In this regards, Japan should need to discuss not only the weapon system itself, but also specific operational plans and its operational planning process and command and control structure, joint combined command and control structure. Let me stop here. Thank you.
So much, Masa. Now we will play a video recorded remarks from probably asleep in Tokyo right now.
By apologizing for not being there in person due to the new coronavirus. disruptive and devastating cyber attacks against governmental networks or critical infrastructure in financial, energy, telecommunication, and so on. This type of cyber attack will be regarded as an armed attack or use of force in certain circumstances. The other one is a cyber attack or a cyber operation below the threshold of an armed attack or use of force. This can be considered a gray zone situation or a gray zone attack in cyberspace. This can include cyber election memory, big data breaches, and cyber-enabled cyber for commercial advantage. In respect of the former type of cyber attacks, Japan's cyber defense policy has made remarkable progress. In December 2018, the Abe administration adopted the new National Defense Program Guidelines, NDPG, which declares that Tokyo will develop and strengthen its cyber defense capability to disrupt the opponent's use of cyberspace for attack against Japan. This concept of disruptive capability is akin to a preemptive action based on the self-defense rights, or is similar to a capability to counterattack against missile-launched bases in North Korea or attack against Japan. Additionally, in April of 2019, the US and Japan remarked that in certain situations, a cyber attack could constitute an armed attack was members of Article 5 of the US-Japan Security Treaty. Japan's Defense Minister Takeshi Iwaya suggested 30 cases where the right and cyber conductive rates might be triggered. The measures and the action taken recently are an important message for potential adversaries. That armed attacks are not the only problem today. Cyber operations below the threshold of such attacks are more common. These cyber attacks may be difficult to deter by good measures and thus deterrence very well. Therefore, present attacks in cyberspace continue to this day. For example, returns powers conduct election metering and post-information operations against democratic countries. They are intended not only to degrade certain candidates and political parties, but also to undermine democratic process and divide social opinion. They focus on controversial issues in the United States. And some states continue to carry out cyber attacks against public-private companies for the purpose of providing commercial advantages to their domestic industries. A typical example is the hacking group named APT10, which is linked with the Ministry of Self-Security of China. This group persistently targets key industries listed in the Made in China 2025 program. These type of cyber attacks are usually carried out in ordinary times, so it is more like an intelligence operation rather than a military action. Tokyo needs to detect cyber operations, persistently track them, and impose cost on its perpetrators. Our reprisal and retaliation should include naming and shaming, financial sanctions, criminal prosecutions, diplomatic sanctions, and countermeasures by both cyber and kinetic means. However, the only measures Japan has taken in cyber attacks so far are naming and shaming twice against North Korea in 2017 due to the computer virus named WannaCry, and against China in 2018 because of the APT10, which I mentioned. As such, adversary might consider Japan a possible target. I present some policy recommendations for the Japanese government in my paper, but I argue the most important one is strengthening attribution capability. Without attribution, adversary will launch cyber attacks with no fear or hesitation. Attribution is vital to identify the source of cyber attacks and impose appropriate cost by sanctions or mitigation measures. Also, attribution is closely related to the ability to constantly monitor malicious communication on the internet. But it is difficult to do that in Japan. As you know, Article 9 of the Constitution has shaped Japan's national security policy since World War II. However, in the field of cybersecurity, access communication on the internet. That is to say, the interpretation of Article 21, not Article 21 itself, is partially in Japan's cyber capability. I think we should start to discuss the meaning and reinterpretation of Article 21. In conclusion, the strides that Tokyo has made have been definitely improvement. However, until the issue of attribution is addressed, it is still not enough. That's all for my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
So while we take down the video, and we move into question and answer right on time. So congratulations to all the authors for speaking exactly 10 minutes. As the moderator with new moderator privileges, I'm going to start us off with a question. I did write questions for each of the authors, but we only have 30 minutes. There are a lot of you. So I will just ask one question that I think is applicable to each of the topics of strategic deterrence, space security, demographic change, Japan's intensifying security environment, and that is the problem of budgeting. Japan's defense budget challenges seem to be the largest constraint for all of these issues. It will affect whether Japan, the self-defense forces, are able to make the SDF more competitive in the job market. It will impact the type of assets that the SDF acquires. It will impact the level of investment that MOD SDF is able to do in capacity building with other countries. So in each of your opinions, what is the most important first step for the MOD to take to work around that budget constraint or to resolve it? Sorry for the really tough first question.
I can start.
Sure.
From my chapter on alliance partnerships, I think the biggest question is sort of the question of burden sharing. You know, Japan already covers either from 75% to 85%, depending on how you calculate the basing cost in Japan of the U.S. forces and basing cost of U.S. forces in Japan. And I think one thing I talk about here is after Trump came into office, Japan really started putting out more information about how much they contribute financially. And previously during Cold War, because of concerns of domestic backlash, they weren't so forthright about how much they are paying. Now it has changed. And it has been strategically promoting how much they've been paying, how much they've been contributing to the alliance. Now, and then there's not much backlash towards that from public. So that's an important change. And I think going forward, I do agree that Japan probably has limits now that it can't increase that much anymore in the burden sharing argument or discussions. But one thing U.S. and Japan can do is really set up standard calculation techniques or standard calculation criteria so that domestic politics don't get in the way and start producing different numbers that confuse two publics between the two countries. I think that's a starting point for how to manage the budget for the basing costs in the relationship with the United States.
That's a really good point, that the defense budget issue is also not just an issue for Japan, but also within the alliance management structure.
Sure. So regarding budget issues, so let me talk about from the standpoint of space. In the Ministry of Defense, MOD, our annual space budget is about $5 million. So which is much, much smaller than the one in US. And also, if you look at R&D, research and development budget in Ministry of Defense, which is about 3% of entire government R&D budget. So as you mentioned, our budget limitation critically impacts on space security policy as well. So what should we do is, I think we need to cooperate with private sector more. So for instance, the good point of spacecraft is its dual use. So private company and the private sector has many know-hows and advantage of commercial space area. So it is critical for Ministry of Defense and also Air Self-Defense Force to utilize those know-how and capabilities in private sector by exchanging those technology to military space. So that's the one option we have to do. And also we need to do a whole of government approach. So I talked about cooperation with government, public and private sector, but also among the public sector, we have to advance the cooperation. For instance, JAXA, Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, which is under, which has many technologies regarding space. So it is critical to cooperate with those agencies to advance security space capabilities in limited budget.
I will add a comment from the perspective of education. According to the book written by the former Chief of Staff, Ground Self-Defense Force, General Iwata, Taiwanese has a strong sense of national defense because they were taught the importance of national defense through the education since the elementary school. When it comes to the Japanese historical education, Japan has a so long history, so the junior high school and high school teachers tend to spend much time on the history before World War I. And post-war education is very limited. So if the young people know and realize the importance of self-defense force in current security environment, they will discuss more security issues and budgetary issues.
That's a really good point, that there's that challenge of the long history, but teaching about what the self-defense force is doing currently, especially in HADR, is a really good way to encourage young people to join. Masa, you wrote a really interesting mini case study of the Izumo-class destroyers and how that refurbishment program is actually not where the MOD, SDF should be spending its money. Could you talk about that and the budget issues?
Yes. So as I already pointed out, that I don't think that the interest to refurbishment of the Izumo and the acquiring F-35B. Actually, that F-35B is a really important asset to operate, and making some difficulties to China's strategic calculation, even in their try to disable some our ASDF's the air bases, even in the F-35B can be the takeoff the same short distance of those kind of airstrips. But at the same time, we need to some other kind of options if we don't take those kind of refurbishment of the Izumo, or some reducing the total number of the fighter aircrafts. So instead of those kind of refurbishment or the acquisitions, we needed to consider some other options, thinking about the other options, such as increasing the number of the long-range anti-ship missiles, ground-based anti-ship missiles, or upgrading some other kind of areas, such as the anti-submarine warfare, which can be relatively easier to maintain our operational advantages against China. But at the same time, to be honest, in my research papers that I'm discussing about, I a little bit explain about the point of the current our force planning systems, JSDF, the force planning system, so-called the capability assessment and the capability analysis, which is introducing from since the 2013 version, previous version of our National Defense Program guideline, which is some kind of comparison, which is the equivalent of the US, the capability-based approach. Through this kind of scientific assessment approach, technically, we mean the defense planners and SDF, the staffs, can recognize to the capability gap. We so-called, in the specific term, joint capability gap in some capability areas. But at the same time, the planning process cannot decide to the scientific approach itself. For instance, some number of the political decisions or political direction involved or intervene to those kind of decisions. So, in the context, the final policy recommendation in my research paper is Japan should establish the NDPG Commission, like a National Defense Strategy Commission in the Congress or in case of the United States. So, which means that I would like to emphasize on providing some other objective assessment from the outside of the government, with they can hold in some security clearance from some other expert, not only the government official. So that is one of the solution to making some more effectively in maintaining the transparency in the policy planning process to the planning of the cost effective.
Thank you so much. I will open up to general questions now. And again, so Joe, please wave your hand. So Joe is our research intern for Japan program. He will be helping you adjust the microphone if you need to.
If you would like to ask questions, we ask that you left going this way, and then speak a little bit away from the mic, not to touch it.
Yes, so we have a gentleman back there already at the microphone.
I wondered, you did mention the artificial island that China has built and building a base on it. And I wondered about the feasibility of building another artificial island, this time off Okinawa, with the intention of moving the air base there to increase its acceptability to the local people of Okinawa, and also another way, a means of either increasing the size of the base or decreasing any negatives regarding it. What are your impressions of this, and do you think this is possible? It's open to the panel.
Any thoughts on placing a base on an artificial island? Solve that basic issue that has plagued us for 26 years?
I think that's a really interesting idea. I never really thought about it. But one of the issue about artificial islands in South China Sea is it's a fixed places that is vulnerable for attacks at the time of war. So I don't know how much benefit there will be to actually establish bases even further as a fixed basis. I think with the power projection capabilities of China nowadays, I think we should invest more on investing in assets that can disperse and move flexibly rather than creating a lot more fixed base that can be attacked by missiles coming from Beijing.
Yeah, I'm agree with what Ayumi-san said. Yeah, technically it's possible to develop artificial island, but there is vulnerability if you develop such kind of like artificial island within the range of Chinese missile capabilities. So instead, if you look at 2018 National Defense Program Guideline as well as 2013's one, so Japanese government is discussed about the use of civil airfield. So we have many of civil airfield inside Japan, and I think it is critical to be able to use those facilities in case of a contingency before thinking about developing artificial islands. That's the first thing we have to do.
So I will add a quick comment. So what is important is balance of deterrence and destruction of environment as for the southern island. So we should not ignore the opinion of local government of Okinawa. So the balance will be important.
question?
Thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Japan native, U.S. citizen, Reagan Foundation. Two questions. Number one, I was in the meeting yesterday, and the speaker was Air Force, U.S. Air Force General. He was speaking about F-35 as to how great fighter jet that is. So my question is, Japan is purchasing F-35. So up to at this point, how many F-35 do you have now? That's number one question. Number two, the Japanese government says the military budget is 1.1% of Japan's GDP. So my question is, if you calculate it to dollar figure, how much would that be? I've been away from Japan for many years now, so about 45 years, so I don't know. So.
Okay. For the first question, how many F-35s we have right now? I'm not sure, but in
27?
Yeah, we just started to introduce F-35 a few years ago, and last year we established a new squadron, and this year we are going to establish second F-35 squadron. So until 2013 National Defense Program guidelines, Japanese government decided we are going to introduce 42 F-35s. But by 2018 National Defense Guidelines and the midterm defense plans, so we decided to introduce additional 105 F-35s, so which means 147 in total in the future. And for the second question was the
GDP.
Oh, GDP. It depends on the rate between dollar and yen, but our defense budget is so far about $55 billion per year.
That's for 2020 fiscal year?
Yeah, in 2020. But it depends on, dollar yen rate. So if you say $1 is 110 yen, so it's about $55 billion.
Thank you.
Another question?
Good afternoon. My name is Kyoko Imai. I am a graduate student at Georgetown University, and I'm currently interning at Sasakawa Peace Foundation. So, Ms. Teraoka, you mentioned that several allies that Japan can work with on defense policy, and many of you talked about multilateral alliances. And so my question is, what can Japan do in the face of rising nationalism, rising populism, and lack of faith in the multilateral system, so such as the U.S. and its America First policy? So what can Japan do if our allies are pulling out and don't want to contribute as much as Japan does?
Okay. Right. So that's happening already, and Japan is still kind of leading the way for multilateral fora, and I think that's what Japan should be doing. And as a democracy, Japan does understand different discourse that happens in different countries, and we just have to be patient, because 10 years ago, Japan was in domestic turmoil, leadership changing every year, but at the time, U.S. was there to help, and other states were engaging, different policies. So what I was kind of trying to imply is different countries have different nationalistic impulse at different periods. So a country like Japan that doesn't have that much of sort of isolationist instinct at the time is the one who should be leading, and then wait until other democracies come back to multilateral fora. I think patience, I think, is important role here.
Any other thoughts on that issue, perspectives? Another question? No one has a question. I have a lot more.
That's going to be a tough one.
All right, I am going to ask a question, and then feel free to go back to the microphone if you think of one. So, Taro, I was really interested by your space article. As a longtime Star Trek fan, finally, we've hit the space age.
It's coming a new one.
That's right. You talked about how important it is to cultivate space professionals, and as well as the development of norms. Are those two initiatives related? And also, do you see sufficient space professional forces, space professional cohorts in other countries?
Yeah, I think they are relating. Developing space norms and developing space professionals are both critical and influence each other. Sometimes creating space norm is difficult to reach agreement because of its dual-use nature of spacecraft. So there is if you're talking about space international norm, there is space norm is ranging from non-legally binding norm, which is like a common understanding of good practice in space, for example, like space debris prevention kind of thing, to legally binding norm, which is disarmament or arms control of spacecraft. So if you are talking about legally binding space norm, you have to take into account security and economic impacts or interest. So space professionals have to be able to understand both sides of interest, economic impact and security impact or interest. So that's why, although I talked about military space professional today, but he or she need to understand both sides of the impact or interest in space. So yeah, that's what I see.
Do you think that the U.S. has enough space professionals, or should we be
Oh,
working
yes,
on this
yeah.
as well?
So if you are talking about U.S. has a much better, quantity and quality of space professional. I mean, Japan is a kind of like a new player as in terms of security space. So we are now trying to develop quality and quantity of space professionals. And new space squadron will be operating in 2022. So, kind of we are rushing to develop human resources right now. So we are learning a lot from US. And US Air Force and the Space Force provide many environment and opportunities to us to educate our people for the future Space Force or Space Command. Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? We still have 8 minutes, so I'm going to run down the clock.
I will ask a question.
Oh, please do, Joe. Thank you.
Yes, so my name is Joe Ross, and I'm the research intern here at Stimson Center. So my question is centered around Taiwan. So do you see a possibility in the future, not just from an alliance standpoint, but from Japan and Taiwanese relations, do you see a possibility of collaboration? And through what means do you see that collaboration? Thank you.
You touched a bit on Taiwan
Yes.
in your paper, Ayumi, but what are the best avenues for cooperation?
I mean, I am aware, and I've read news about sort of informal exchange of intelligence in the behind the scene about, vessels coming in the East China Sea, and it's not like officialized framework, but definitely intelligence sharing is one way to go with it. There is also some discussion about, Taiwan itself also needs to strengthen sort of intelligence protection framework as well, and so does Japan. So that is another venue. Two societies have very strong ties already. Prime Minister Abe's brother just went to Taiwan and congratulated Tsai's election. And President Tsai already went to Yamaguchi Prefecture where Abe is elected from. So the social ties are strong. In terms of security cooperation, it will involve strategic talks, economic cooperation. Taiwan wants to join TPP, I believe. So that's one avenue. And intelligence sharing is another fora, I think.
Any thoughts, Masa?
To be honest, that it is I think the question, my answer is simple. It depends on the political willingness of the Japanese government. So, of course, that in the private or public level or some other think tank, including my former the institution, the Okazaki Institute, but also the Harrison Institute, sometimes having some bilateral or trilateral meeting or TTX dealing with the Taiwan crisis scenario. But at the same time, of course, I understand the difficulties to invite some government officials or that kind of event or the meeting. But at the same time, so it's behind that political difficulties, our means that the think tank communities has an important role to encourage those kind of communication in the regularly and share our problems and the issues and the solutions. So in that reason, we can some other type of we can upgrade the track 1.5 level the closed workshop during not only Japan but not only bilateral meeting between Taiwan and Japan, but also it should be involved to the U.S. officials for some kind of opportunities.
So I will close out with the last question. This is first to Yoshi, but I think everyone can also answer this. So in terms of the aging population, Japan is ahead of the curve for many countries, even though all across the world in the coming decades, more and more countries will experience the pressures of a population that is aging and shrinking. And there are a lot of lessons that Japan can take from other countries, but what lessons can Japan offer for security challenges in the face of demographic change? And similarly, with all of your research topics, what does Japan have to offer in terms of lessons learned?
According to the annual report on the aging society, there are mainly two factors of aging society. The first factor is the increase of number of people aged 65 or over due to the improvement of living condition or improvement of dietary and nutritional condition and the advancement of medical technology after World War. I think this improvement and advancement will continue, so it will be difficult to prevent the increasing number of elderly people. So the second factor of aging society is a decrease in the number of young people due to the declining birth rate. So one of the lessons is if the country which is facing the graphical challenge should more concentrate on the solution of declining birth rate. So, for example, Japan is promoting the introduction of free early childhood care and considering the work-life balance between the men and women.
Thank you. Lessons from Japan?
Can I offer questions to add my question on top of your question?
Sure, sure.
Which is the question of AI and question of robotics. And some American experts do wonder about investment in those technology and utilization of robotics technology to kind of complement with the shortage of personnel in SAF.
Yeah, absolutely, you're right. We have to take that option as well. And as Yoshi mentioned, we have to advance female forces. Like we need to promote like military contractors and also using emerging technologies to shape our organization for the new structure. So that's something we need to do. But I think Yoshi mentioned a very important point, because in SDF, the female forces is only 11% of entire forces. By contrast, the US has more than 13%. So what we have to do for now is advancing the female forces. And also we have to shape the support system for female to work in military and child care, and also working in the military. Those efforts are critical to maintain force structure right now.
All right, we have run out of time. Thank you so much to our 4 authors and to Kawaguchi-san in Tokyo. Thank you so much for coming out to join us. Please take several copies of Key Challenges in Japan Defense Policy. If you end up in quarantine, this is great reading. And this publication is also available on our website, and we'll probably be sending it out in a mass email. Please forward it to all your friends and colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.